Welcome back. You are listening to the home of forbidden romances. Prepare yourself, because tonight's story will leave you breathless. The blade pressed against the soft skin of my throat was cold, but the eyes of the man holding it were colder, glittering shards of amethyst that promised a slow, agonizing death. Give me one reason why I shouldn't carve your treacherous heart out right now and mail it back to your father, the man growled, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards and straight into my marrow. I didn't need to check a mirror to know I looked pathetic. I was trembling, my nightshirt soaked in a cold sweat that smelled of terror and sickness, kneeling on the hard stone floor of a bedchamber that looked more like a mausoleum than a bridal suite. But behind the tears I forced into my eyes, my mind was racing at a mile a minute. I recognized the scar bisecting his eyebrow. I recognized the crest of the black wolf on his doublet. This was Duke Cassian Draven, the Butcher of the North, the villain of the novel I had fallen asleep reading just hours ago. And I was now inhabiting the body of Valerian Thorn, his newlywed husband, a sacrificial Omega spy destined to be executed in Chapter 1. Because, I gasped, letting my breath hitch dramatically as I leaned into the blade just enough to draw a single, mesmerizing bead of blood. If I die, you'll never find where the poison is hidden. It was a bluff, a desperate, reckless gamble. But as Cassian's eyes narrowed, the lethal pressure on my throat eased by a fraction of an inch. That was all I needed. The transition into this world had been violent. One moment, I was a corporate litigator in New York, buried under case files. The next, I was waking up with a headache that felt like a cranial fracture, memories that weren't mine flooding my consciousness. I was Valerian Thorn, the third prince of the Southern Empire, a sickly, discarded Omega known for his delicate constitution and his family's utter ruthlessness. I had been sent north as a peace offering, a pretty bird in a gilded cage, tasked by the Emperor to infiltrate the North and assassinate the only man who could challenge the imperial throne. The original Valerian had been a fool, arrogant, and clumsy. He had tried to stab Cassian on their wedding night. I, however, had no intention of dying twice in 1 week. Cassian withdrew the dagger, though he didn't sheath it. He towered over me, a monolith of black leather and fur, radiating an alpha pheromone that smelled of storm-charged ozone and burnt cedar. It was oppressive, designed to force submission, but I bit the inside of my cheek to ground myself. Poison, Cassian repeated, the word dripping with skepticism. You expect me to believe a frail thing like you managed to poison my stronghold? Not the stronghold, Your Grace, I whispered, lowering my eyes to the floor, feigning a tremor in my hands. I hunched my shoulders, making myself look smaller, more fragile. The treaty. You know the magic binding our marriage. If I die by your hand within the first year, the blood pact triggers. The magical backlash won't kill you, but it will cripple your aura, leaving the North vulnerable to my father's armies. I looked up through my lashes, ensuring my expression was one of terrified innocence. I am not protecting myself, husband. I am protecting you. Cassian stared at me for a long, suffocating moment. He was analyzing me, dissecting every micro-expression. The original Valerian was known to be a vapid, spoiled brat. I had to pivot. I had to be the victim. Get up, he finally barked, turning his back on me to pour a glass of dark amber liquor. I rose on shaky legs. The body I inhabited was weak, anemic, lacking muscle tone, and suffering from a damaged pheromone gland that made me smell faintly of withered lilies. It was a pathetic vessel for a man who used to run marathons, but I would make it work. You will stay in the West Wing, Cassian commanded, not looking at me. If you step foot near my study, the armory, or the barracks, I will have you thrown to the hounds. Pact or no pact, accidents happen in the North, Valerian. Remember that. Yes, Your Grace, I murmured, clutching my chest as if breathing was a chore. I only wish to rest. The journey. It was difficult for someone of my constitution. He waved a dismissive hand. I scurried out of the room, my bare feet slapping against the cold marble. The moment the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me, I straightened my spine. The trembling ceased. The terrified tear was wiped away with a calm, calculated swipe of my thumb. I had survived the night. Now, I had to conquer the villain. The following weeks were a masterclass in psychological warfare. To the servants, I was a ghost. I spent my days in the solar, wrapped in 3 layers of furs, coughing delicately into silk handkerchiefs. The staff viewed me with a mixture of pity and contempt, the southern prince who couldn't handle a gust of wind. Perfect. While I played the invalid, I listened. I learned that the North was starving because the Southern Empire had blockaded the grain trade. I learned that Cashin's generals were restless, urging him to war. And I learned that there was a traitor in the castle, someone feeding information to my father, the emperor. One afternoon, I sat in the frost-covered gardens, a book of poetry open on my lap. Inside the poetry book, however, were loose pages I had stolen from the library, ledgers of the estate's finances. I was cross-referencing grain shipments with tax revenues, my mind working through the forensic accounting with the ease of my former life. A shadow fell over me. Poetry, a deep voice sneered. I didn't jump. I had heard his heavy boots crunching in the snow 50 yards away. I hurriedly shoved the ledger pages into my sleeve and looked up with wide, startled eyes. Cashin stood there, wind whipping his dark hair across his face. He looked exhausted. Dark circles bruised the skin beneath his eyes. Lord Byron, Your Grace, I lied smoothly, my voice trembling. It comforts me. Cashin snatched the book from my hands. He flipped through it, sneering at the flowery verses. He didn't see the ledger pages. I had been too quick. He tossed the book back into my lap with a scoff. Useless, he muttered. Like your father. He sent another letter demanding to know if you were pregnant yet. I flushed, not from embarrassment, but from the sheer audacity of the politics. I am sorry to disappoint him. And you? Cashin leaned down, gripping the arms of my garden chair, trapping me. His face was inches from mine. Do not think I don't see you watching, Valerian. You wander the halls like a specter. You speak to no one. You are up to something. I am merely trying to survive the cold. Cashin, I whispered, using his given name for the first time. He flinched. The intimacy of it caught him off guard. I seized the moment. I reached out, my pale, thin fingers brushing the fur of his cloak. You look tired. The grain shipments from the east. They were delayed again, weren't they? Cashin froze. His hand shot out, gripping my wrist tight enough to bruise. How do you know about the shipments? That was discussed in a closed council meeting. I heard the maids gossiping. I stammered, widening my eyes, letting a tear pool in the corner. Please, you're hurting me. He released me instantly, looking at his own hand with disgust, then back at me. Servants don't know about the eastern route. They know the cooks are rationing flour. I countered softly, rubbing my wrist. And I know that if you lower the tax on the merchant guilds in the port city of Oakhaven, you could bypass the blockade by using smugglers. It would cost more upfront, but it would prevent a famine before winter fully sets in. Silence stretched between us, heavy and thick. The wind howled through the skeletal trees. Cashin stared at me, really stared at me, for the first time. He wasn't looking at the weak southern Omega anymore. He was looking at something he couldn't categorize. A smuggler's route, he murmured. That is illegal and dangerous. Starvation is more dangerous, I said, dropping the stutter. My voice was steady, cool, and logical. And dead peasants pay no taxes. Cashin's eyes narrowed. Who are you? I blinked, and the mask slipped back into place. I coughed, covering my mouth, my shoulders hunching. Just a useless prince who reads too much poetry, Your Grace. He didn't believe me, but he turned and walked away. 2 days later, the decree to lower taxes in Oakhaven was signed. The famine was averted, and I knew I had hooked him. The turning point came a month later, during the Festival of the Frost Moon. The castle was thrown open to the nobility, a dazzling display of ice sculptures and velvet finery. I was forced to attend, draped in silver silks that hung loosely on my frame, emphasizing my frailty. I stayed by Cashin's side, playing the dutiful, silent spouse. The attack happened during the waltz. It wasn't an assassin aiming for Cashin. That would have been too predictable. The assassin came for me. If I died, the magical pact would backlash on Cashin, weakening him enough for the southern armies waiting at the border to strike. As the orchestra swelled, a waiter lunged, a jagged glass shank aimed at my ribs. Time seemed to slow. The old Valerian would have screamed and died. I didn't. As the attacker lunged, I didn't step back. I stepped in. I used the momentum of the waltz, spinning into the attacker's guard. I stomped hard on his instep, shattering the small bones of his foot, and drove my elbow back into his solar plexus. It was a messy, desperate maneuver, limited by my weak muscles, but it was effective. The attacker gasped, the shank missing my heart and slicing shallowly across my upper arm instead. I collapsed to the floor, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I needed to sell the narrative. Valerian. The roar was deafening. Cashin was there in a heartbeat. He didn't hesitate. His sword was drawn, and with a single, brutal stroke, the assassin was silenced forever. The ballroom erupted in screams. Cashin dropped his sword and fell to his knees beside me. The scent of his distress, burning wood and ozone, flooded the air, so potent it made the betas in the room gag. He scooped me up, ignoring the blood staining his pristine uniform. "You fool," he hissed, his face pale. "Why didn't you run?" I gasped, clutching my bleeding arm. "I couldn't. Let him hurt you." It was a lie. I knew the assassin was aiming for me. But Cashin didn't know that. He thought I had thrown myself in harm's way to protect him. He carried me out of the ballroom, kicking open the doors. He didn't take me to the infirmary. He took me to his chambers. He laid me on his massive bed, barking orders for hot water and bandages, dismissing the servants so he could tend to me himself. As he cleaned the wound, his hands were surprisingly gentle. The Butcher of the North had hands that trembled slightly as he stitched my skin. "Why?" he asked, his voice rough. "You are a hostage. A pawn. Why fight?" I looked at him, the pain in my arm grounding me. "Because I am tired of being a pawn, Cashin. And perhaps I prefer the wolf I know to the snakes I left behind in the south." He paused, the needle hovering over my skin. He looked at me, and for the first time, the amethyst ice in his eyes melted. "You are not weak," he whispered, almost an accusation. "The move you made, the way you shifted your weight, that was not luck. That was training. I read about it," I lied weakly. "Liar," he growled, but there was no heat in it. He finished the stitch and bit the thread. Then, he did something unthinkable. He leaned down and pressed his forehead against mine. The contact was electric. "You are a liar, Valerian. But you are my liar." The dynamic shifted. The weakness became a game between us. In public, I was the frail consort, leaning heavily on the Duke's arm, fainting during boring council meetings to give Cashin an excuse to leave. In private, I was a strategist. I reorganized his supply lines. I rooted out the spy, the head chamberlain, whom I framed beautifully with forged documents. I became the shadow behind the throne, the brain to Cashin's brawn. But the final test remained. The emperor, my father, grew impatient. He summoned us to the imperial capital for the winter solstice. It was a trap. We both knew it. "We shouldn't go," Cashin argued, pacing the length of his study. "He plans to execute me for treason. He'll claim I corrupted you. If we don't go, he invades," I said, sitting on his desk, swinging my legs. I was healthier now, my cheeks flushed with color, though I still played up the cough when necessary. "We go, and we end it." "How?" "Leave that to me." The imperial court was a pit of vipers. The throne room was gilded and suffocating. My father sat on the high throne, looking down at us with disdain. "Duke Cashin," the emperor boomed. "You are accused of sedition. And you, Valerian. Look at you. Thin, pale. He has mistreated you. He has." I cried out, throwing myself onto the floor before the throne. The court gasped. Cashin went rigid, his hand drifting to his sword. I had not told him this part of the plan. "He forces me to eat meat," I wailed, burying my face in my hands. "He makes me wear fur. And he refuses to let me send my allowance back to you, Father." The court fell silent. It was a ridiculous complaint. It made the emperor look petty for caring about such trivialities. But I continued, my voice changing, dropping the wine. I stood up slowly, dusting off my knees. I looked directly at the emperor. He also respects the northern borders. He protects his people. And unlike you, Father, he has never tried to sell his own son for a strip of land. The emperor's face turned purple. "Guard. Seize them." "I wouldn't," I said calmly. "Unless you want the southern lords to know about the accounts you've been siphoning from the royal treasury to pay for your mistress's palace in the east." I pulled a scroll from my sleeve. Not a handkerchief this time. Evidence. "I spent my youth in your library, Father." I smiled. A sharp, dangerous smile that mirrored Cashin's own. I didn't just read poetry. I read the ledgers you thought were hidden. The uproar was immediate. The southern lords turned on the emperor. Chaos erupted. Cashin stepped forward, his hand resting possessively on the small of my back. He drew his sword, not to fight, but to command. The North stands with Valerian Thorn. Anyone who wishes to challenge his claim to the truth can answer to me. No one moved. We returned to the North not as fugitives, but as conquerors. The emperor was deposed by his own council, replaced by a regency that feared the North too much to attack. That night, in the safety of the obsidian citadel, the pretense finally dropped completely. I stood by the window, watching the snow fall. Cashin came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist, pulling me flush against his hard chest. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, inhaling deeply. "You terrified me today," he murmured, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin over my mating gland. "I thought you were betraying me." "I told you," I said, leaning back into him, melting into the warmth. "I'm a strategist. I play the long game." "You played the victim," he corrected, turning me around so he could look into my eyes. His gaze was intense, burning with a mix of admiration and raw hunger. "You pretended to be glass so they wouldn't see the diamond." "Are you angry?" I asked, tracing the scar on his eyebrow. "Angry?" Cashin laughed, a dark, rich sound. He caught my hand and kissed the palm, his eyes never leaving mine. "I spent my life fighting monsters, Valerian. I never expected to marry one. It is exhilarating." He lifted me up effortlessly, carrying me toward the bed. "But tell me, my deceitful little Omega, are you too weak for what comes next? Should I be gentle?" I smirked, wrapping my legs around his waist and pulling him down with me. "I don't know, Cashin. You might have to check my pulse. I feel a fainting spell coming on." "Brat," he growled, capturing my lips in a kiss that tasted of victory and forever. And that is how the viper tamed the wolf. If you enjoyed seeing Valerian take control from the shadows, destroy that like button. And tell me in the comments, would you forgive a husband who held a knife to your throat on the first night, or would you have let the assassin finish the job? I'll be reading your answers. Subscribe for the next chapter. Until then,